The morning of April 14, 1960, came into Los Angeles the way spring mornings sometimes came into that city, with a quality of light that made everything look slightly more significant than it had the day before, as if the sun had reconsidered its approach overnight and decided to be more deliberate about where it placed its attention. And Frank Sinatra was in the Capitol Records building on Vine Street at 7:45 in the morning, which was not a time Frank Sinatra was typically in any building that was not a hotel, having arrived early for a session that was not scheduled to begin until 9 because he had not slept well and had eventually decided that lying in bed watching the ceiling was less useful than being somewhere that had a purpose. And he was sitting in the building's small cafeteria on the ground floor with a cup of coffee that was better than hotel coffee, but not as good as what his housekeeper made, reading nothing, looking at the table, when a woman sat down across from him without asking if she could sit there, which in Frank Sinatra's experience was either a sign of extraordinary confidence or of someone who had not noticed who was sitting at the table. And when he looked up, he found that it was the second of these, that the woman who had sat down across from him was looking at her own coffee cup, with the concentrated expression of someone whose mind was entirely elsewhere, and who had selected this particular chair by proximity rather than by choice. The woman's name was Frances Bergman, and she was 49 years old, and she worked as a music copyist for Capitol Records, had worked there for 11 years, and she was one of perhaps 30 people in the building at this hour, because the morning shift at Capitol began at 8, and the recording sessions began at 9. And the various producers and engineers and musicians arrived in waves that started now and continued until 10. And Frances had come in early because she had copying work due by noon that she had not finished the previous evening. And the reason she had not finished it was something she had not told anyone at Capitol, and that she had spent the previous week deciding whether she needed to tell anyone, which was that her hands had been bothering her in a way that had been getting progressively worse for 6 months, and that she had finally seen a doctor about, and that the doctor had told her was a tendon condition that was being aggravated by the repetitive motion of her work, and that would continue to worsen if she continued the same volume of copying without intervention. And the intervention the doctor recommended was a significant reduction in her workload for an extended period, which was information that Frances had been sitting with for 5 days, without knowing what to do with it, because reducing her workload was not something she could do without telling her supervisor, and telling her supervisor meant risking her position. And Frances was 50 years old next year, and had been a music copyist for 23 years, and had no other professional skill that paid comparably, and the prospect of losing her position or having it diminished was something she had been trying to think around without success. Frank Sinatra watched Frances stare at her coffee for approximately 3 minutes and then said, "Whatever it is, it's not going to solve itself while you're looking at that cup." And Frances looked up with the startled expression of someone who had genuinely not registered another person at the table until this moment. And then recognition came, and her expression moved through several stages and settled on something that was too tired for the usual social performance that celebrity proximity required. And she said, "I'm sorry, Mr. Sinatra, I didn't see you." And Frank Sinatra said, "I noticed." And there was a moment where the conversation could have ended there, where Frances could have moved to another table or Frank Sinatra could have gone back to looking at the surface of his own coffee. But neither of them did either of these things. And instead Frank Sinatra said, "What's the problem?" in a tone that was direct without being intrusive, the tone of someone who had spent enough time around people in trouble to recognize when asking was more useful than pretending not to notice. What Frances Bergman told Frank Sinatra over the next 15 minutes was the situation with her hands, and the doctor's recommendation, and the professional dilemma this created. Told it with the precision of someone who had been thinking about it constantly, and had organized it into a clear account without quite realizing that was what she had done. And Frank Sinatra listened without interrupting, and without the particular quality of half-attention that people sometimes offered when they were waiting for someone to finish talking, so they could offer a solution they had already arrived at, but with the full attention of someone genuinely processing what he was hearing. And when Francis finished, Frank Sinatra said, "How long have you been a music copyist?" And Francis said, 23 years. And Frank Sinatra said, "And you're good at it?" And Francis said, "I'm very good at it," without false modesty, because modesty about professional competence after 23 years seemed to Frank Sinatra like the wrong response to the question. And Francis seemed to understand this. And Frank Sinatra said, "Does the doctor know what specifically is causing the problem?" And Francis said the doctor believed it was the combination of fine motor work with the particular grip required for copying notation, the specific angle of the pen against paper over many hours. And Frank Sinatra said, "So the work itself isn't the problem. The method is the problem." And Francis said, "That's what the doctor seemed to be saying, yes." And Frank Sinatra said, "Have you looked into whether the same work can be done differently?" And Francis said she hadn't, that she had been too focused on the professional risk of telling anyone to think about the technical question. Frank Sinatra finished his coffee and stood up and said, "Come with me." And Francis followed him through the building's corridors to the third floor where the production offices were. And Frank Sinatra knocked on the door of a producer named Leonard Harris, who was one of the senior people at Capitol, and who Frank Sinatra knew had been at the label since its early years, and who therefore understood the building's institutional memory in ways that newer people did not. And Leonard Harris opened the door in the middle of drinking his own morning coffee and said, "Frank, it's 8 in the morning." And Frank Sinatra said, "I know what time it is, Leonard. I've been here since before 8, and stepped into the office with Francis behind him. And Leonard looked at Francis with the expression of someone trying to place a face he recognized from professional context without remembering the context. And Frank Sinatra said, "This is Frances Bergman. She's been copying music for Capitol for 11 years, and for the industry for 23 years, and she has a medical situation with her hands. And I want you to think with us about whether there's a way to restructure how her work is done so she can continue doing it." And Leonard said, "Frank, this is a personnel matter." And Frank Sinatra said, "I know it's a personnel matter, Leonard. That's why I'm in your office instead of mine. Do you have someone in this building who knows about adaptive work methods or equipment modifications for hand injuries?" And Leonard, who had been progressively adjusting his morning expectations since Frank Sinatra had appeared at his door, said that there was actually a woman in the building's administrative division who had done some work with the film industry on accommodation for injuries. And Frank Sinatra said, "Good, call her." And Leonard did. And the woman, whose name was Irene and who arrived at Leonard's office 12 minutes later, turned out to know a great deal about modified grip techniques and angled writing surfaces, and the specific question of whether music copying could be adapted for someone with Francis's condition. And the conversation that followed lasted an hour and involved Irene describing specific adaptations that other copyists had used in the film industry and Francis responding to each suggestion with the specific professional knowledge of someone who understood her own work in precise detail. And by the end of the hour, there was an outline of a modified approach to Francis's work that Irene believed could reduce the strain on her tendons significantly without compromising the quality or speed of her copying. And Leonard Harris had agreed to fund the acquisition of the specific angled board and modified pen grip that the modifications required. Frank Sinatra left Leonard's office at 9:15 to go to his own session and did not attend the rest of the conversation. And when he left, he did not say anything to Francis except that he hoped it helped. And Francis stood in Leonard Harris's office after Frank Sinatra had gone and tried to understand what had just happened, which was that a problem she had been sitting with alone for a week, and that had seemed to her to have no good resolution, had been addressed in one morning by a person who had nothing to gain from addressing it except the satisfaction of having addressed it. And this resolution had come from Frank Sinatra noticing that a stranger was sitting across from him, staring at a coffee cup, with a quality of distracted worry that he had recognized and had chosen to ask about rather than to ignore. Frances Bergman worked at Capitol Records for another 14 years, until her retirement in 1974, using the modified equipment and technique that had been identified in Leonard Harris's office. And her tendon condition, improved sufficiently over the first year that her doctor was satisfied, and she never had another conversation with Frank Sinatra, beyond a brief exchange in a corridor the following year, when she had said thank you and Frank Sinatra had said for what in a tone that was not quite disingenuous, but was the tone of someone who preferred that the things they had done recede into the background of daily life, rather than becoming events that required ongoing acknowledgement. And Francis had said for that morning in 1960, and Frank Sinatra had said I was there anyway and walked on. And that was the entirety of what passed between them as a direct acknowledgement of what had happened, what Francis told her daughter about the morning, in a conversation that happened 20 years later when her daughter was working through her own professional difficulty, and Francis was trying to offer something useful, was not the specific facts of what Frank Sinatra had done, but the principle she had extracted from it, which was that problems that seem to have no solution often have solutions that are simply outside the frame in which you've been looking at the problem, and that the frame changes when someone asks you to describe the problem out loud to another person, and that the most important thing Frank Sinatra had done that morning was not call Leonard Harris or arrange the meeting with Irene, but had been the question he asked in the cafeteria, which was what is the problem, because that question had required Frances to describe her situation accurately rather than to continue circling around it in the anxious way she had been circling for a week. And the accurate description had led to the frame shift, which had led to the solution. And Frank Sinatra had simply been the person who asked the question, which required nothing of him except the willingness to notice and to ask. And Frances believed that this was the underrated thing about the people she had seen do genuinely useful things in her life, that they were not necessarily smarter or more resourceful than other people, but that they had the specific willingness to ask a question when a question was needed, and then to actually listen to the answer, and that this willingness, which cost nothing and was available to anyone, was somehow the rarest quality she had encountered in nearly 50 years of living and working in a world full of people who had learned to look away from other people's coffee cups.